Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another section of Music 1300. I am, of course, Professor George. We are here for our second lecture about form and structure in music. Last lecture, we talked about sonata allegro form, which is a very complicated form, or somewhat complicated form, in regards to the symphonic instrumentation, or pieces written for orchestra that are kind of in a more classically oriented configuration. We discussed that the form has two opposing different thematic ideas that undergo a developmental section, which then comes back to a recapitulation and occasionally ends with a coda. It's a really well-balanced form, and often the form that composers use for the first movement of a symphony. It's a great compositional way to showcase some of your best ideas. We're going to talk about form or structure in a different kind of context today. Form or structure in music happens by means of repeating ideas. We've also seen repetition in a number of different sort of dimensions this semester. One way in which we've heard repetition of musical materials in regards to form in a much looser kind of way would be the tone poems and program symphonies of the Romantic era, which often rely on leitmotifs, melodies that represent people, places, characters, ideas, situations, moods, you name it. It's kind of like theme music, but often that theme music or those leitmotifs come back within a piece of music. And when you come back to an idea, you're essentially creating musical structure. Structure is created in music by repetition of ideas. So we're going to trace a particular or particularly interesting idea to me that's withstood the test of time and is a particularly macabre or spooky idea, and that is the Dies Irae. The Dies Irae is a song that represents the Day of Wrath, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when I go over to my lecture notes. But in short, it's a really iconic melody that's been used in a number of different situations that I think we as listeners are indeed aware of. So I wanted to trace the use of that particular melody or fragment of that melody through 6 different listening examples that kind of traverse musical history. We're going to talk about the original, which is quite old. We're talking 17th century, and we'll play the original, which is in monophonic texture, and see how it's sort of been woven into more contemporary literature, or pieces from the canon, so to speak. So at this point, hopefully you already have a piece of paper that you're taking notes with. I have lecture notes that I'll toggle over to, but yeah, enjoy. Let me go ahead and pull up my lecture notes. Okay, so here are the lecture notes for today. I misspoke. The Dies Irae is older than the 17th century. It's from the 13th century, but let's go ahead and start there. So it's a Latin sequence, which does indeed date back to the 13th century, or it indeed could be older, but it's a medieval poem. And it describes the Last Judgment. And it's specifically the Last Judgment, when a trumpet summons the souls before the throne of God, where the saved will be delivered and the unsaved cast into eternal flames. Ugh. So the day of wrath is what it is trying to sonically signify here. It is a particularly ominous tune, and we'll listen to it shortly. The first setting that we're aware of is a setting of Gregorian chant, and it's one of the most quoted melodies within the musical canon. Below here, I have notated actual manuscript. So notice that the first phrase that's within this this curved line, which we call a phrase marking, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pitches. Those 8 pitches are kind of divided out into what we call like a question and answer component, where the first 4 pitches are answered by the last 4 pitches. Bum, 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 bum. That's our first 4. Bum, 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 bum. Sort of slightly off pitch there, but those are our the second 4. So that sequence of 8 notes, which is usually combined with the second phrase of the melody in a larger question and answer format, are the 2 elements of the Dies Irae that are most quoted. So like I said, like when a composer quotes a melody, especially one that's been used as often as this specific melody, there's going to be some point kind of where the composer decides to break off and write his or her own kind of variation or deviation of this melody. Just like we discussed in sonata allegro form, that point of deviation can't be too soon. One of the most iconic features of this particular melody is certainly the first 4 notes. So we're not going to hear any deviations that are sooner than the first 4 pitches of this work. Otherwise, we wouldn't really be able to identify it as clearly as we would need to understand that it's being referenced. And that's an important point. So let me go ahead and pull up a Gregorian chant rendition. It's obviously not authentic from the 13th century because we didn't have recording technology back then, but there are certain groups that are still performing Gregorian chant works in a historically appropriate style. So let me go ahead and find and play an original setting of the Dies Irae. One moment. All right, so like I said, we're going to be really trying to trace the first 4 and more specifically the first 8 pitches, the first kind of phrase. We're going to hear that phrase because there's going to be kind of a small break afterwards. That initial phrase is answered by another phrase, a secondary phrase. So we have this sort of overarching A, B sort of format. All right, here we go. So that first 10 seconds of this audio file is really the major part of the Dies Irae that we're concerned about. Let's listen to it one more time. Like I said, it's broken up into 2 phrases. Dies Irae, dies illa, salve seclum infamilla. Did you guys catch it? We're going to go back one more time. Hopefully you're seeing that I'm annotating the musical example rather than speaking over it with a 1, that's our first phrase, and then a 2 for our second phrase. I'm going to let it play the whole musical excerpt until we get a female answer. It's obviously the whole piece as it's originally set is somewhere close to 8 minutes. However, the opening here is what's most iconic and most often quoted by composers. Let's listen to it one more time. Dies irae, dies illa, salve seclum infamilla. Te se Davidum sibilla. Und das Christus heard that initial larger phrase, which has two sort of smaller subcomponents, is often reused in the minute that we listen to. Repetition creates importance in a piece of music and also creates form. So part of the reason why that particular selection of the Dies Irae is so iconic is also because within the original, it's repeated a number of times. In any case, well, one more thing about repetition. Certainly, if we were to be doing lectures in person, one of the things that I would aim to do if something was particularly important is repeat the idea over and over that I want you to remember, because if I don't repeat it, I'm not going to draw attention to it, and once I draw attention to it, it becomes more important. So probably the most important thing that I want you to remember for the first part of this lecture is indeed the quotation that we're trying to listen to here. The Dies Irae, 13th century, where we're occasionally going to hear the first 4 notes, but more likely the first 8 notes of that iconic melody before a composer kind of takes his or her own turn on how they wish to recreate it. Because direct quotations are only fun if you're sort of using them in your own original context. Same kind of applies to any sort of English papers that you're doing. The quotation should be not the entirety of the paper. You need your own sort of explanation and work on that same quotation, which of course applies to music composition as well. In any case, one of the things that we're going to be doing is tracing the Dies Irae in a couple of different contexts. We're going to start off in the Romantic era, talk about another programmed symphony that makes use of the Dies Irae. We're going to talk about it in a music theater context with Sweeney Todd, visit it in the context of cinema and talk about Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, and talk about it in a couple of other absolute or sort of program music contexts as well. So we're going to start off with Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. But one of the reasons why the Dies Irae is used is because because of its connotation. So we use it because it's trying to recall in some sort of sense the Last Judgment or implications of the final judgment. So looking forward to showing you how it's used in a number of very, very, very different contexts. We'll start out with a more romantic or classic in the sense that it's for orchestra, oriented sense with Berlioz, who uses it very, very deliberately within his Symphonie Fantastique. See you guys for part number 2 soon.